Richard Thompson chuckled as he eyed the rusty old bike, shaking his head in disbelief. The attorney's office, with its mahogany paneling and leather-bound books, seemed an odd setting for such a decrepit relic. He glanced at his brother David, who sat quietly in the corner, hands folded in his lap. "You can't be serious," Richard scoffed, turning to the attorney. "This heap of junk is all our father left him." The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, your father's will was quite clear. The bicycle goes to David, along with a small trust fund. You, Richard, inherit the bulk of the estate, including the family business and properties." David's eyes never left the bike. His fingers traced the faded paint, lingering on tiny scratches that seemed to form a pattern. "It's more than enough," he murmured. Richard's laughter echoed through the room. "More than enough. It's barely fit for the scrapyard. I'll buy you a new one, little brother. Hell, I'll buy you a car." "That won't be necessary," David replied, his voice steady. This was Dad's. "It means something." "What it means is that the old man had a twisted sense of humor." Richard straightened his designer suit. "Now, if we're done here, I have a company to run." As they left the office, Richard strode ahead, phone already in hand. David wheeled the bike carefully, its rusty chain creaking with each turn. Sarah, David's wife, waited outside, her face lighting up as she saw them. "So, how did it go?" she asked, embracing David. Richard snorted. "Wonderfully. I got the Empire. Dave got the Junkyard Special. Equality at its finest." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I'm sure your father had his reasons, Richard." "Yes, senility." Richard checked his watch. "Look, I've got to run. Enjoy your new ride, Dave. Try not to get tetanus." As Richard's sports car roared away, Sarah turned to David. "Don't let him get to you. Your dad loved that bike." David nodded, his fingers still tracing the frame. "There's something here, Sarah. Look at these markings." Sarah leaned in, her brow furrowing. "They almost look like words." "Not quite. More like a code." David's eyes lit up. "Remember how Dad used to leave us treasure hunts when we were kids? Always with these weird symbols." Sarah smiled. "You think he left you one last adventure?" "Maybe." David's voice was soft, but there was a spark in his eyes that Sarah hadn't seen in years. "I need to talk to Edward. He might know something about this." The next day, David and Sarah visited Edward Moore's modest home. The old man, once John Thompson's closest friend and confidant, welcomed them warmly. "David, my boy, and lovely Sarah, what brings you here?" Edward's roomy eyes twinkled behind thick glasses. David wheeled in the bike. "Dad left me this, Edward. I was hoping you might shed some light on it." Edward's eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be John's old Schwinn. Many a mile we put on these beauties back in the day." "There are markings on it," David said, pointing them out. "They look like Dad's old codes." Edward leaned in, squinting. His wrinkled face broke into a grin. "Well, I'll be damned. That crafty old coot. You recognize it?" Sarah asked. Edward nodded. "Oh yes. John and I used this system during our early business days. Kept our competitors guessing." Just then, the door burst open. Richard strode in, his face a mask of irritation. "What's this I hear about secret codes?" David straightened. "Richard, how did you dash?" "I had my assistant track your phone," Richard said dismissively. "Can't have you running around town spreading rumors about Dad's secret treasures or whatever nonsense this is." Edward's eyes hardened. "This is a private conversation, Richard." "Nothing in this family is private," Richard snapped. "Especially not when it comes to Dad's estate." David stepped between them. "Richard, please. This isn't about money." "Everything's about money, little brother. You're just too naive to see it." Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Richard. If you can't be civil, you can leave." Richard's jaw clenched. "Fine. Play your little games. But when this wild goose chase is over, don't come crying to me." As Richard stormed out, David turned back to Edward. "I'm sorry about that. Can you help us decipher this?" Edward nodded slowly. "It'll take some time. But yes, let's see what your father left behind. Over the next few hours, Edward and David pored over the bike, decoding the tiny engravings. Sarah brought them coffee, watching as the two men worked in silent concentration. Finally, Edward sat back, a triumphant smile on his face. Got it. The first part anyway. David leaned forward eagerly. What does it say? The key to the past lies where the future began, Edward read. Classic John, always with the riddles. Sarah frowned. What does that mean? David's eyes widened. The old factory, where Dad started his first business. Edward nodded approvingly. Smart lad. That'd be my guess too. As they prepared to leave, David's phone buzzed. It was a text from Richard. Got the bike appraised. You might want to see this. Curiosity piqued, they met Richard at a high-end antique shop. The appraiser, a bespectacled woman in her 50s, greeted them with barely contained excitement. Mr. Thompson, this bicycle is extraordinary, she gushed. It's not just any old Schwinn. This model was custom-made for Orville Wright himself. Richard's smug smile faltered. What? The appraiser nodded enthusiastically. Oh yes. See these unique modifications. They're hallmarks of Wright's personal designs. If we can authenticate its provenance, this bicycle could be worth a small fortune. David stared at the bike in disbelief. But how? Dad never mentioned anything about this. Your father was full of surprises, Edward chuckled. Always had a nose for hidden value. Richard's face had turned an interesting shade of red. This changes nothing. It's still just a rusty old bike. The appraiser shook her head. Not all, Mr. Thompson. This bicycle is a piece of aviation history. Its true value lies in the stories it could tell, if only we could unlock its secrets. As they left the shop, Richard grabbed David's arm. This isn't over. Whatever game Dad was playing, I want in. David shook him off. It's not a game, Richard. And it's not about money. Can't you see that? But Richard was already striding away, phone in hand, no doubt calling his lawyers. David sighed, turning to Sarah and Edward. What now? Sarah asked. David's eyes gleamed with determination. Now we find that key. Dad left us a trail, and I intend to follow it to the end. As they headed towards the old factory, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. The bike's chain creaked softly, a quiet reminder of the journey ahead. Whatever John Thompson had hidden, whatever lesson he'd meant to impart, David knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The old factory loomed before them, a hulking silhouette against the darkening sky. Its broken windows and rusted gates spoke of forgotten dreams and abandoned potential. As David wheeled the bike towards the entrance, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. This is where it all started, Edward mused, his voice tinged with nostalgia. John and I spent countless nights here, dreaming up schemes that would change the world. Sarah squeezed David's hand. Your father built an empire from nothing. Who knows what other secrets he left behind? They made their way through the derelict building, flashlights casting eerie shadows on walls covered in peeling paint and faded motivational posters. David's eyes darted from corner to corner, searching for anything out of place. Over here. Edward called out suddenly. He was standing in front of an old safe, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. This was John's first big purchase. Said it represented security and potential. David approached the safe, his heart racing. He ran his fingers over the dial, feeling for any hidden markings. There's something engraved here, he murmured. It looks like coordinates. Sarah pulled out her phone, quickly typing in the numbers. Her eyes widened. David, these coordinates, they point to your childhood home. A slow clap echoed through the empty factory. Richard emerged from the shadows, a sardonic smile on his face. Bravo, little brother. You've solved Daddy's first little puzzle. What's next? A trip down memory lane. David straightened, facing his brother. Why are you here, Richard? Insurance, Richard replied smoothly. Can't have you stumbling on to some hidden fortune without me, can we? After all, I am the primary heir. Edward stepped forward, his usually kind eyes now hard as flint. "This isn't about inheritance, Richard. Your father wanted to teach you both something far more valuable than money." Richard scoffed. "Please. Dad was a businessman, through and through. Everything was a transaction to him." "You're wrong," David said quietly. "Dad valued family above all else. This, whatever this is, it's his way of bringing us together." "How touching," Richard sneered. "Well, if you're done with the Hallmar moment, shall we continue this wild goose chase?" As they left the factory, the tension between the brothers was palpable. Sarah walked between them, a buffer against the years of resentment and misunderstanding. Edward followed behind, his eyes sad as he watched the two men John Thompson had raised. The childhood home was a modest two-story house in a quiet suburb. As they pulled up, memories flooded back. Summer barbecues, holiday gatherings, the laughter and tears that echoed through its walls. David wheeled the bike up to the front door, his hand hesitating over the knocker. "I can't believe someone else lives here now," he murmured. "Oh, they don't," Richard said, producing a key. "I bought it last year as an investment property. It's been sitting empty." David turned, surprised. "You never told me." Richard shrugged. "You never asked." As they entered the house, the musty smell of disuse greeted them. Sheets covered the furniture, and dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights. David made his way to the living room, drawn by some instinct he couldn't explain. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing to the mantelpiece. A single envelope sat there, yellowed with age but untouched by dust. With trembling hands, David opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of two young boys, Richard and David, riding the very bike that had started this journey. On the back, in their father's familiar scrawl, was a message. "To my boys, remember, the greatest treasures are those we carry in our hearts. The journey is just beginning." Richard peered over David's shoulder, his face unreadable. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away, and they were just two brothers, united in the memory of their father. But the moment passed. Richard cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Well, what's the next clue?" David studied the photo closely. "There's something here, a reflection in the bike's chrome. It looks like a safety deposit box key." Edward nodded slowly. John had a box at the old merchant's bank downtown, but was set to be opened only on a specific date. Sarah checked her phone, her eyes widening. "That date is 3 days from now." Richard's face hardened. "Then we have 3 days to figure out what the old man was playing at. I won't let some sentimental nonsense jeopardize my inheritance." As they left the house, the bike creaking softly in the night air, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something life-changing. Whatever their father had planned, whatever lesson he'd meant to impart, it was clear that the real journey was just beginning. The stars twinkled overhead, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. In the distance, a clock tower chimed, marking the passage of time. 3 days. 3 days to unravel a lifetime of secrets, to bridge the chasm between brothers, and to discover the true meaning of inheritance. David wheeled the bike down the darkened street, its rusty frame a stark contrast to Richard's sleek car. As they parted ways for the night, the tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. But beneath the surface, a spark of something long forgotten flickered to life. A shared curiosity, a mutual challenge, and perhaps the faintest glimmer of hope for reconciliation. The morning sun cast long shadows across David's workshop as he hunched over the old bicycle, a magnifying glass in one hand and a soft cloth in the other. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but a fierce determination drove him forward. Every inch of the frame held potential secrets, and he was determined to uncover them all. Sarah entered, balancing 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You've been at this all night, haven't you?" David straightened, his back cracking in protest. "I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something crucial." She set the mugs down and peered at the bike. "Any new discoveries?" "Nothing concrete, but dash." David's words were cut short by the workshop door banging open. Richard strode in, his designer suit a stark contrast to the dusty surroundings. "Still playing treasure hunter, little brother?" David's jaw clenched. "What do you want, Richard?" "To speed things along." Richard produced a small tool from his pocket. "This UV light should reveal any hidden markings. Let's see what dear old Dad was really hiding." Before David could protest, Richard switched on the light and ran it along the frame. Suddenly, a series of faint symbols glowed an eerie blue. Sarah gasped. "David, look." The brothers leaned in, their rivalry momentarily forgotten. Intricate patterns danced across the metal, forming what appeared to be a map. "It's the old mine system," David breathed. "Dad used to tell us stories about the tunnels under the city." Richard's eyes gleamed. "And now we know why. There's something down there he wanted us to find." David shook his head. "We can't just go charging into abandoned mines. It's too dangerous." "Scared of the dark, Davy?" Richard sneered. "Or afraid of what we might find?" Sarah stepped between them. "This isn't a competition. Your father left these clues for both of you." Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face darkening. "We don't have time for caution. The safety deposit box opens in 2 days. Whatever's down there, we need to find it before then." David frowned. "How do you know about the safety deposit box?" A flicker of guilt crossed Richard's face before his usual arrogance reasserted itself. "I have my sources. Now, are we doing this or not?" The tension in the room was palpable as the brothers stared each other down. Finally, David nodded. "Fine, but we do this my way. Safely." Hours later, they stood at the entrance to an old mining shaft, the rusted gate creaking ominously in the wind. Edward had insisted on joining them, his weathered face etched with concern. "John and I explored these tunnels in our youth," he said, his voice hushed. "But they've been unstable for years. We must tread carefully." Richard scoffed, already pushing past the gate. "Time's wasting. Let's go." They descended into the darkness, their flashlights casting dancing shadows on the damp walls. The air grew thick and musty, heavy with the weight of forgotten secrets. David consulted the map they'd copied from the bike. "We should be nearing a junction. There should be a marking dash." A loud crack echoed through the tunnel. Richard stumbled, his foot breaking through a rotted wooden plank. He toppled forward, arms flailing. David lunged, grabbing his brother's jacket. For a heart-stopping moment, they teetered on the edge of a yawning chasm. Then, with a grunt of effort, David hauled Richard back to safety. Panting, Richard stared at the pit he'd nearly fallen into. Thanks." David nodded, his own heart racing. "We need to be more careful. This place is a death trap." They pressed on, the brothers now moving with greater caution. As they rounded a bend, Sarah's flashlight caught something glinting in the wall. "Look." She pointed to a small metal plate embedded in the rock. Engraved on its surface was a familiar symbol, the same one they'd seen on the bike. Edward ran his fingers over the engraving. "It's a locking mechanism. John showed me something similar once. There should be a key." David's eyes widened. He pulled out the small key they'd found at the old factory. With trembling hands, he inserted it into a nearly invisible keyhole. A low rumble filled the tunnel. Dust rained down as a section of the wall slowly swung open, revealing a hidden chamber. Richard pushed forward, his earlier fear forgotten. "What's this place?" The chamber was small but meticulously organized. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old ledgers and mysterious artifacts. In the center stood a pedestal, upon which rested an ornate wooden box. David approached the pedestal, his heart pounding. As he reached for the box, Richard's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "Wait," Richard hissed. "What if it's booby-trapped?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "This isn't an Indiana Jones movie, Richard." But David hesitated. He might have a point. Dad always loved his puzzles. "Edward, what do you think?" The old man squinted at the pedestal. "There's an inscription here. It says, 'The key lies in unity.'" The brothers exchanged glances. Richard's face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, how touching." Daddy wants us to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. David ignored him, studying the box. Look, there are 2 keyholes. I think we need to open it together. Richard's laugh was bitter. Of course, because we're such a perfect team. Can you put aside your ego for 1 minute? David snapped. This is what Dad wanted. Are you in or not? For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of water echoing through the cavern. Then, slowly, Richard nodded. They each took a side of the box, inserting their keys simultaneously. With a soft click, the lid sprang open. Inside lay a stack of old photographs and a leather-bound journal. As David reached for them, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground. Sarah picked it up, her eyes widening as she read. It's from your father. He says the real treasure isn't here. Richard's face contorted with rage. Then what the hell have we been doing down here? David ignored him, flipping through the journal. His face paled. Richard, you need to see this. The journal detailed a series of high-stakes business deals their father had been involved in, deals that skirted the edge of legality. But more shockingly, it revealed a long-hidden truth. John Thompson hadn't built his empire alone. He'd had a silent partner all along, Richard and David's mother. She was the real financial genius. David read aloud. Dad was just the face of the operation. Richard snatched the journal, his hands shaking. This can't be true. Dad always said dash. He lied, Edward said softly. To protect her, and to protect you boys. Your mother wanted you to forge your own paths, not rely on her wealth. The revelation hit the brothers like a physical blow. Everything they thought they knew about their family, about their father's legacy, crumbled around them. Richard's face was a mask of fury and betrayal. All this time, everything I've worked for was built on a foundation you never knew existed. David finished. The tension in the chamber was electric. Richard's fists clenched and unclenched, his breathing ragged. For a moment, it seemed he might lash out at David, at Edward, at the very walls of the cave. Instead, he spun on his heel and stormed out of the chamber, his footsteps echoing through the tunnels. David moved to follow, but Sarah caught his arm. Give him time. This is a lot to process. As they gathered the contents of the box, a final note from their father caught David's eye. The true test isn't finding the treasure, boys. It's what you do with the truth once you've found it. They emerged from the mine into the fading afternoon light. Richard's car was gone, leaving them stranded. Edward sighed heavily. Your father hoped this journey would bring you together. I fear it may have driven you further apart. David stared at the horizon, the weight of their discovery heavy on his shoulders. We have one more day until the safety deposit box opens. One more chance to unravel this mystery. Sarah squeezed his hand. And one more chance to reach your brother. As they made their way back to town, the old bike creaking in the trunk of Edward's car, David couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of their journey was yet to come. The truth they'd uncovered in the depths of the earth threatened to shatter the very foundations of their family. But perhaps, he thought, from those broken pieces, something stronger could be built. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and perhaps a final chance at reconciliation. For now, the night air hummed with unspoken tensions and the promise of secrets yet to be revealed. The clock tower chimed midnight as David paced his living room, the old bike propped against a wall like a silent sentinel. Sarah watched him from the couch, worry etching lines across her forehead. He's not answering his phone, David muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. It's been hours since he stormed off. Sarah stood, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Richard's always been one to lick his wounds in private. He'll surface when he's ready. A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. David rushed to answer it, hope and dread warring in his chest. But instead of Richard, he found Edward, his weathered face grave. We have a problem, Edward said. Stepping inside, he produced a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. I found this taped to my door. David snatched the note, his eyes widening as he read. It's from Richard. He says he's going to the bank tonight to crack the safety deposit box himself. Sarah gasped. But it's not supposed to be opened until tomorrow. He doesn't care, David growled, already reaching for his coat. He's desperate to prove he can solve this on his own. Edward's voice was heavy with concern. If he tampers with that box, he could destroy whatever your father left inside, not to mention the legal ramifications. David's jaw clenched. We have to stop him. The streets were eerily empty as they sped towards the bank, the old bike rattling in the trunk of Edward's car. As they rounded the corner, they saw Richard's sports car parked haphazardly in front of the building. He's already inside, David breathed, his heart racing. They approached the bank cautiously, the darkness broken only by the dim glow of emergency lights inside. The side door hung open, its lock clearly forced. David turned to Sarah. Stay here with Edward. Call the police if we're not out in 10 minutes. Before she could protest, David slipped inside, the familiar smell of polished marble and old money filling his nostrils. He made his way to the vault area, guided by the sound of muffled cursing. He found Richard hunched over the safety deposit box, a set of lockpicks in his trembling hands. Richard, stop. David's voice echoed through the empty bank. Richard whirled, his face a mask of desperation and rage. Back off, David. I'm finishing this myself. David took a cautious step forward. Think about what you're doing. This isn't what Dad wanted. You don't know what he wanted. Richard spat. All my life, I've tried to live up to his expectations, to be the successful son, and now I find out it was all built on lies. We were both lied to, David said softly, but destroying his legacy won't change that. For a moment, it seemed Richard might relent. Then his eyes hardened. I'm not destroying anything. I'm claiming what's rightfully mine. He turned back to the box, his picks working furiously at the lock. David lunged forward, grabbing his brother's arm. What happened next was a blur of motion and anger. Richard's elbow caught David in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. David stumbled, his hand catching on the bike, chain still looped around his wrist. As he fell, the chain snagged on the safety deposit box, yanking it from its slot. The box hit the floor with a sickening crack, its contents spilling across the polished tiles. Both brothers froze, staring at the scattered papers and photographs. Among them lay a single envelope, addressed to my sons, in their father's familiar scrawl. With shaking hands, David picked up the envelope and tore it open. He read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard, David, if you're reading this, then you followed the trail I left for you. I hope you made the journey together, but knowing you both as I do, I fear you may have let your differences drive you apart once again. The truth is, there is no grand treasure waiting for you, no hidden fortune to fight over. The real inheritance I leave you is the chance to rebuild the bond you once shared as brothers. The safety deposit box will open automatically at noon tomorrow. Inside, you'll find one final task. Complete it together, and you'll understand the true value of what I've left behind. Remember, boys, wealth fades, but family is forever. Love, Dad. Silence fell over the vault, broken only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. Richard slumped against the wall, all fight draining from him. All this for nothing. His voice was hollow. David shook his head, clutching the letter. Not nothing. A second chance. As the police burst in, David made a split-second decision. He grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him to his feet. Follow my lead, he whispered. To the officers, David spun a tale of a suspected break-in, of the two brothers rushing to secure their father's legacy. It wasn't entirely a lie, he reasoned. They had been trying to protect something precious. They just hadn't realized what it was until now. Hours later, as the first light of dawn painted the sky, David and Richard sat on the steps of the bank, exhaustion etched on their faces. Sarah and Edward had gone to fetch coffee, leaving the brothers alone for the first time since their confrontation. Richard broke the silence, his voice rough. I'm sorry for everything. David nodded, too drained for words. He pulled out their father's letter, rereading it silently. What do you think the final task is? Richard asked, a hint of his old curiosity creeping into his tone. David shrugged. Knowing Dad, it could be anything. But we have Dash, he checked his watch, for hours to figure it out. A ghost of a smile tugged at Richard's lips. Just like old times. Remember when he used to send us on those ridiculous scavenger hunts? How could I forget? You always insisted on racing ahead, and I'd end up fishing you out of whatever trouble you'd gotten into. The brothers shared a chuckle, the tension between them easing slightly. As the city began to wake around them, they found themselves swapping stories of their father, the good, the bad, and the utterly absurd. At 11:55, they stood before the safety deposit box once more, this time with Sarah and Edward flanking them. The bank manager hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the unorthodox situation. As the clock struck noon, the box clicked open with an anticlimactic whisper. Inside lay a single key and another envelope. David read the note aloud. Congratulations on making it this far, boys. Your final task is simple. Take this key to the old boathouse by the lake. What you find there will be your true inheritance. But remember, it only works if you go together. Richard frowned. The boathouse. But that old thing's been abandoned for years. David's eyes lit up with understanding. Not abandoned. Waiting. The drive to the lake was tense, each brother lost in thought. As they pulled up to the dilapidated boathouse, memories flooded back. Summers spent fishing, learning to swim, their father's booming laugh echoing across the water. The key slid into the rusty lock with surprising ease. As the door creaked open, they were met not with musty darkness, but with a flood of sunlight. The interior had been transformed. Fresh paint gleamed on the walls, adorned with framed photographs of the Thompson family through the years. In the center stood a beautifully restored wooden boat, the very one their father had taught them to sail in. On the bow, a plaque read, "The Brothers' Bond." Tears pricked at David's eyes as he ran his hand along the smooth wood. Richard stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "He wanted us to remember," David said softly, "to rebuild what we lost." Richard nodded, unable to speak. His gaze fell on an old fishing rod propped in the corner, his childhood favorite. Beside it lay David's tattered copy of Treasure Island, the book that had sparked his love of adventure. As they explored the boathouse, rediscovering pieces of their shared past, the weight of years of resentment and misunderstanding began to lift. They found themselves laughing at old jokes, completing each other's sentences as they recounted long-forgotten stories. Sarah and Edward watched from the doorway, smiles on their faces. "John would be proud," Edward murmured. As the afternoon sun began to dip towards the horizon, David and Richard stood on the dock, looking out over the tranquil water. "So," Richard said, breaking the comfortable silence, "what do we do now?" David grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Well, we have a boat, and if I remember correctly, you still owe me a rematch from that race back in '95. Richard's eyebrow arched. "Oh, it's on, little brother." As they scrambled to prepare the boat, their laughter echoing across the lake, both brothers knew that they had found something far more valuable than any material treasure. They had rediscovered the unbreakable bond of family, the greatest inheritance their father could have left them. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the lake in hues of orange and purple as David and Richard guided the boat back to shore. Their laughter echoed across the water, a sound that had been absent for far too long. As they secured the boat, Richard's smile faded. He stared at the boathouse, his expression unreadable. "This doesn't change anything, you know." David's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "This nostalgia trip. It's nice, but it doesn't erase years of resentment, or the fact that our entire lives have been built on lies." David opened his mouth to argue, but Richard held up a hand. "I need some time to think. Alone." Without another word, he strode off into the gathering darkness. Sarah approached, concern etched on her face. "Is everything okay?" David shook his head. I thought we were making progress, but Edward's weathered hand clasped David's shoulder. Give him time, lad. Some wounds take longer to heal. The drive back to town was silent, the old bike rattling in the trunk like a persistent reminder of unfinished business. David's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of their father's puzzle. What was the final lesson John Thompson had tried to impart? As they pulled up to David's house, a figure emerged from the shadows. Richard stood on the porch, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more vulnerable. Can we talk? His voice was barely above a whisper. Inside, the brothers sat across from each other, the old bike propped between them like a silent mediator. Richard's eyes were red-rimmed, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. I've been thinking about what Dad wrote, about rebuilding our bond. He took a shaky breath. The truth is, I've been chasing his approval my whole life. Every business deal, every acquisition, it was all to prove I could be as successful as him. David leaned forward. Richard, you don't have to dash. Let me finish. Richard's voice cracked. When I found out about Mom's role in the business, it felt like everything I'd worked for was a lie. But sitting in that boat today, remembering how things used to be between us, I realized I've been chasing the wrong thing all along. Tears welled in David's eyes. It's not too late, you know, to start over. Richard nodded, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Maybe you're right, but first we need to finish what Dad started. There's still one piece missing from this puzzle. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Sarah answered it, returning with a puzzled expression and an envelope in hand. It's from your father's lawyer. He said it was to be delivered at exactly this time. The brothers exchanged glances. David carefully opened the envelope, reading aloud. My dear boys, if you're reading this, then you've taken the first steps towards reconciliation. But your journey isn't over yet. There's one final key to retrieve, one that will unlock not just a vault, but the true meaning of our family's legacy. Return to where it all began, the place where Thompson Industries first took root. Look beneath the foundation, and you'll find what you seek. Remember, the greatest treasures are often hidden in plain sight. Love, Dad. Richard's eyes widened. The old factory, where we found the first clue. David nodded, a spark of excitement igniting in his chest. We need to go back. The factory loomed before them, a hulking silhouette against the night sky. Armed with flashlights and determination, the brothers made their way inside, retracing their steps to the room where they'd found the safe. Look beneath the foundation, Richard muttered, running his hands along the walls. What does that mean? David's flashlight beam caught something, a faint outline on the floor. He knelt, brushing away years of dust to reveal a trapdoor. Here. Together, they heaved the door open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The brothers shared a look of trepidation before David took the first step down. The basement was small and cluttered, filled with old machinery and forgotten relics of their father's early business ventures. In center stood a simple pedestal, upon which rested a small, ornate box. Richard reached for it, but David caught his arm. Wait, remember what happened last time we rushed into things? Nodding, Richard stepped back. You're right. We do this together. They examined the box carefully, noting the intricate engravings that matched those on the bike. 2 keyholes adorned the front, a familiar sight that brought a smile to both their faces. Just like the safety deposit box, David mused. I think I know what to do. From his pocket, he produced the key they'd found in the boathouse. Richard mirrored the action, pulling out the key from the safety deposit box. On 3. Richard asked, a hint of his old competitive spirit creeping into his voice. David grinned. 1, 2, 3. They inserted the keys simultaneously, holding their breath as they turned. With soft click, the box sprang open. Inside lay a stack of papers, old stock certificates, deeds, and financial records. But atop it all was a letter, addressed simply to my sons. With trembling hands, David unfolded it and began to read. Richard, David. If you're reading this, then you've completed the journey I set out for you. I hope that along the way, you've rediscovered not just the clues I left behind, but the bond you once shared as brothers. The documents in this box represent the true foundation of our family's wealth, not just in monetary terms, but in the partnerships and relationships that made it all possible. Your mother's brilliance, Edward's loyalty, and countless others who believed in our vision. But the real treasure isn't in these papers. It's in the lesson I hope you've learned, that true wealth lies not in what you own, but in the connections you forge and the love you share. The Thompson legacy isn't about money or power. It's about family, trust, and the unbreakable bond between brothers. I'm proud of you both, more than you'll ever know. All my love, Dad. Silence fell over the basement as the brothers absorbed their father's words. Richard's shoulders began to shake, and David realized his brother was crying, truly crying, for the first time in years. Without hesitation, David pulled Richard into a fierce embrace. They clung to each other, years of misunderstanding and resentment melting away in the face of their shared grief and newfound understanding. When they finally pulled apart, Richard wiped his eyes, a watery chuckle escaping him. Dad always did know how to make a point. David nodded, his own vision blurry with tears. He certainly did. As they climbed the stairs back to the main floor, a weight seemed to lift from both their shoulders. The first light of dawn was breaking through the factory windows, casting everything in a new, hopeful glow. Outside, Sarah and Edward waited anxiously. Their faces lit up as they saw the brothers emerge, walking side by side, matching grins on their faces. "Well?" Sarah asked, barely containing her excitement. David held up the box. "We found it. The real treasure." Edward's eyes twinkled. "And what might that be?" Richard threw an arm around David's shoulders. "Each other." As they drove back to town, plans already forming for how to honor their father's legacy, David's gaze fell on the old bike, still faithfully strapped in the trunk. "Hey, Rich," he called to his brother, who was driving. "What do you say we take that thing for one last ride?" Richard's eyebrow arched, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "Race you to the park." Hours later, as the city began to wake, two grown men could be seen pedaling furiously down the street on a rusty old bicycle, their laughter echoing off the buildings. Passers-by stared in bewilderment, but David and Richard didn't care. They were too busy rediscovering the joy of simply being brothers. As they coasted to a stop in the park, breathless and giddy, Richard pulled something from his pocket, an old, creased photograph. It showed two young boys, grinning widely as they balanced on the very bike they'd just ridden. Scrawled on the back in their father's handwriting were the words that had started all: "Wealth fades, but family lasts forever." David smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. He was right, you know. Richard nodded, slinging an arm around his brother's shoulders. "Yeah, he was. Took us long enough to figure it out, though." As they walked the bike back home, planning a family dinner and reminiscing about childhood adventures, both brothers knew that they had found something far more valuable than any material inheritance. They had rediscovered the unbreakable bond of family, the greatest treasure their father could have left them. And as for the old bike, it found a place of honor in David's living room, a constant reminder that sometimes the most precious things in life are the ones that can't be measured in dollars and cents. The Thompson brothers had finally learned the true meaning of wealth, and it was a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives.